Good morning and welcome. My name is Dan Battier. I am an adjunct fellow at Hudson Institute, and I'm pleased this morning to welcome Dr. Paul Angelo to discuss his new book, From Peril to Partnership, U.S. Security Assistance and the Bid to Stabilize Colombia and Mexico. The book draws on years of field work to evaluate these two landmark security assistance initiatives. Paul is director of the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Security at the National Defense University. He is also a reservist in the U.S. Navy. His book and his views today are not official views of the Department of Defense. Paul, welcome to Hudson, and I'd like to kick things off by just asking you for an overview of the book.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to Hudson for the invitation to join you all today. It's a real pleasure, and this is a book that's been many years in the making and just launched. We had our official release last week, so everything is quite fresh, and it's a real pleasure to be here as one of my first stops on a tour in promoting the work that I've put into this. And really, the book, From Peril to Partnership, takes a look at the two most significant U.S. security assistance efforts in Latin America and the Caribbean in the 21st century. Plan Colombia, which ran from about 2000 to 2011, and the Mérida Initiative in Mexico, which ran from 2007 to about 2017. And despite similar ambitions on part of the U.S. government, similar strategic objectives, and similar resources to include the alignment of U.S. executive agencies and departments on how to deal with the security challenges that were posed by both Colombia and Mexico, we saw that Plan Colombia and the Mérida Initiative resulted in quite disparate outcomes. On the one hand, Plan Colombia was held up by policymakers here in the United States and by Colombians themselves as a model of stabilization, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics work, and democracy promotion. As we saw the major metrics of violence and insecurity in Colombia drop over the span of Plan Colombia's execution, whereas the Mérida Initiative in Mexico, despite an ambition to reform security institutions so that they could better address the needs of the Mexican citizenry, ended up not accomplishing their objectives. And we saw security issues mount and insecurity and violence rise over the span of the Mérida Initiative, basically peaking around 2019, in the year shortly thereafter the conclusion of the Mérida Initiative. And so the question that I posed for myself as somebody who had previously worked in uniform when I was active duty in the Navy on Plan Colombia, had spent many years doing field work in Mexico, was why did our two major security assistance programs from the US side not achieve their objectives in the same way? And here I point not to what we could have done better on the US side of the equation, but rather on how our security assistance was received by partners in Colombia and Mexico, and what were the political and social contours in the recipient country that affected the ability of security forces, police and military in those countries from making good on the resources, the new technology, the agenda setting, and the partnership that Plan Colombia and the Mérida Initiative represented. And here I point to three main factors. The first being the attitudes of business elites in the countries. In Colombia, you had business elites who rallied behind the same objectives that were put forth by Colombian political leadership and the US government in partnering with the Colombian government at the beginning of Plan Colombia. Whereas in Mexico, with some subnational, at the level of cities and states, variation, for the most part, business elites did not rally behind the objectives of the Mérida Initiative, and instead diverted their resources invested into private security rather than the provision of state security and state institutions. Another factor was the degree of party polarization or political ideological polarization in the recipient countries. In Colombia, there was an overwhelming consensus amongst amongst the parties of the Colombian political system that security was too fragile in the country for there to be an electoral logic or calculus behind the politicization of security. And so parties, regardless of where they sat on the political spectrum, all rallied around the objectives of Plan Colombia and the international partnership that it represented as a way of fortifying the security sector. Whereas in Mexico, particularly following the bitterly fought election in 2006 in which President López Obrador, current President López Obrador, was defeated by President Felipe Calderón by a very narrow margin, security became rapidly politicized in the aftermath of that election. And particularly as López Obrador traveled around Mexico for more than a year, identifying himself as the legitimate president of Mexico, because he never conceded to his opponent, despite Calderón's victory in the election. And so security, which became a mantle of the Calderón administration, became, in the eyes of his opposition, a real liability for Calderón and the PAN. And thereafter, security was politicized, not just at the federal level, but at the state and the municipal levels as well, which lends to my third major contention that the federal system in Mexico actually really complicated the ability of the United States government to advance a security assistance agenda simply because Mexico has a very decentralized security architecture. In addition to the fact that there's not a single Ministry of Defense at the national level, there's a ministry or a secretariat for the Army and the Air Force and a secretariat of the Navy that are completely separate cabinet-level positions. You also have a complete decentralization of the policing apparatus, whereas national judicial bodies have their own police forces or investigative forces. At the time, Calderón's impetus was to build up a national police force, the federal police. But there was never a coordination amongst those police forces at the national level, let alone a coordination with those police forces, with subnational police forces. Because in Mexico, at the state level and at the municipal level, there are more than 1,800 different police bodies that don't have a consolidated chain of command, that don't have the same hiring or recruitment standards, that don't even wear the same uniforms, and quite worryingly, don't abide by the same standards of professionalism, which means that these police forces at the subnational level often serve as the major conduits for organized crime to thereafter capture state institutions. And so what you had in Mexico was a complete decentralization of the security apparatus that made it very difficult for the United States to achieve objectives when we were only, for the most part, focused on working with national level institutions. Whereas in Colombia, you have a highly centralized security sector, in fact, which the national police report to the Minister of Defense. And they are co-equal with the four, or in this case, three of the Marines are a subset of the Navy, as they tend to be here in the United States as well. But the three armed services, the national police is a co-equal body within the Ministry of Defense. And so that any reforms or technology adoption or hardware transfers that the United States was encouraging or facilitating through Plan Colombia were adopted at the level of the minister and trickled down through a rather hierarchical and centralized organization.
Your book manages to provide clarity on a very complex topic with many different pieces and many different institutions involved. Have you seen similar clarity in the analysis in these two countries? How are the two initiatives seen in Colombia and Mexico today?
I think Colombia today, because we're now more than 10 years removed from the real end of Plan Colombia, and we've seen a peace process with the FARC that has changed the security dynamic and also the political dynamic in the country. I think Colombia today is perhaps at risk of forgetting the best lessons of Plan Colombia, but I do think that there is an overwhelming sense that Plan Colombia was an important facilitator of the country's transformation, not just the security transformation, but its transformation, the transformation of its image globally. I mean, on the other side of Plan Colombia, Colombia became a member of the OECD. Colombia is the only Latin American nation that is a NATO partner today. Colombia and the United States have a robust free trade agreement. None of that would have been possible were it not for the very sort of elemental help that Plan Colombia represented. And I think that for the most part, Colombia, regardless of party and regardless of the fact that now today we have a President Petro who is a departure in terms of national representation. If you look at the history of Colombian presidents, he nonetheless recognizes the importance of the U.S.-Colombia relationship and has prioritized that in his engagements globally. Whereas in Mexico, I think there's a broad consensus at the political level that the Mérida Initiative was a failure, not because of anything that the United States did wrong, but frankly, the institutions in which the United States were investing, principally the federal police, have since disappeared from the scene. A deliberate decision made by President López Obrador to disband the national police, which he found to be corrupt, abusive, and perhaps a little bit too politically associated with the Calderón administration. And so one of the primary institutions into which the United States was investing its resources and seeking to improve citizen security outcomes no longer exists today. President López Obrador also showed up in office saying that the Mérida Initiative was dead from his assumption of office, and said he no longer sought a military relationship or military support from the United States, and instead he preferred the United States to invest in social development as a way of attacking the root causes of violence in the country. And so I think that there's broad consensus in Mexico. The Mérida Initiative had sort of outlived its utility, and as there was a strategic pivot here in the United States, away from that kind of support for Mexico and the U.S.-Mexico security relationship, it was reflected by a pivot in Mexico City as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, in discussing the role of the private sector, you mentioned two local private sector initiatives to bring resources and transparency to the security effort. I thought those were perhaps the most encouraging thing in the book. Are those types of programs replicable, and you know, is there a chance we might see more of those types of efforts around the region?
So in the chapter in which I discuss the role of business in supporting security initiatives, in Colombia you have the very prominent instance of the imposition of a democratic security tax, which helped bankroll the reform, professionalization, and transformation effort that was ongoing in the Ministry of Defense. And in Mexico, although we never saw that conversation unfold at the national level, there were subnational governments that were inspired by Colombia's example, frankly, and they called in advisors from Colombia who had worked on the democratic security tax to help them figure out how they could, at a subnational or state level, raise taxes for the purpose of security. But in Mexico, you have, historically speaking, a big divide between political elites and financial elites. They tended not historically to come from the same classes. Mexican political elites historically have come from the ranks of the middle class, whereas financial elites obviously represent the highest income earners in the country. And so there's always been a bit of a misalignment of priorities and a bit of a distrust there. And so one of the big hurdles that we saw the private sector and local government were able to overcome in places like Chihuahua, Ciudad Juárez, or Monterrey in Nuevo León, was to create a scenario in which the private sector could contribute funds voluntarily to a deal with rising insecurity and particularly drug-related crime, while never really relinquishing full control of how those resources would have been spent. There was always a suspicion that if the private sector were paying additional resources into the government, that the government would misuse those resources. So what the private sector did in the case of Ciudad Juárez in particular was set up a fund, a trust basically, in which the private sector paid a payroll tax into this fund, and the pooled monies were thereafter, the spending of the pooled monies was thereafter determined by a council of citizens in which the private sector, academia, NGOs, civil society, and then other government interlocutors all came together to determine how those resources were going to be spent. And one of the major priorities was reforming the local police in Ciudad Juárez, and providing the police with a dignified salary so that they would be able to resist the temptation of corruption, et cetera. Something similar was tried in Monterrey, and with the establishment of the Fuerza Civil, the civil force, which is the state police of Nuevo León, perhaps one of the more professional subnational or even national police forces in Mexico, since the Fuerza Civil had a unique quality of not just recruiting people locally, but also recruiting the best police talent from throughout the rest of the country. And so, unfortunately, in the instance of Monterrey, once violence subsided, the private sector no longer saw a need to keep sustaining the programming in a way that allowed them to meet their full ambition for the development of the Fuerza Civil. So it never actually met its quota in terms of the number of people it was going to recruit. And we've seen, as a consequence, sort of a lapse in terms of security provision across the state. But nonetheless, I would point to those as two very promising examples that with the right set of circumstances where the private sector's investments feel protected and secured and will be spent accordingly, that there's a real opportunity for the government and big business to work collaboratively on reducing the incidence of violence and crime.
Has there been any movement to share these experiences and see them implemented elsewhere in Latin America?
So I think at least at the level of fostering better ties between the private sector and government, there have been attempts to replicate that model other places in Mexico at the subnational level. And one of the challenges that you confront, frankly, is the level of cohesion amongst elites. The unique thing about Monterrey and Ciudad Juarez is that elite circles there are quite closed. And even though in Monterrey they represent a diversity of industries, they've always been a sort of a tightly wound entity and have always sort of shared a corporate voice. But when you take that same model and you try to implement it in a place like Michoacán, where there are agricultural elites and the industries tend not to have as much cohesion as they did in border states. And so I think that's a real risk. But we have seen attempts at the national level across Latin America and the Caribbean to introduce security taxes. And they've had varied success. Right now, President Noboa in Ecuador is attempting to do the same because he needs to facilitate a transformation of his institutions, particularly the national police, so that Ecuador can avoid a permanent militarization of its response to drug violence. But in other places across Latin America where the imposition of security taxes occurred, we've also seen a real tendency at the national level, particularly where justice systems are weak, to use those resources in ways that benefit the incumbent in clientelistic and anti-democratic ways. And so without the right safeguards, there's a real risk of funds being misappropriated and misused.
You mentioned the militarization of the security effort, which is something that we're seeing in several countries in Latin America. What does your analysis say about this trend, and what are the alternatives?
I mean, militarization is an incredibly attractive option for countries across Latin America and the Caribbean today that are dealing with really staggering levels of violence and criminality. But militarization without a vision of what an off-ramp looks like runs the risk of becoming permanent militarism, which is anti-democratic. And what happens is, bringing in the military to deal with acute scenarios of public insecurity, it plays well with the public because militaries across Latin America and the Caribbean tend to be among the most trusted institutions. And it plays well with the military in some cases, although there are instances in which the military has pushed back on political incentives to get involved in issues of public order. But for the most part, it plays well with military institutions because they have access to resources and in budgets that they otherwise didn't have access to. But in the long run, what it does is it guts opportunity to actually build out the civilian capacity that you need in order to provide steady state security for your population. And it makes the military an essential actor. And all the while, as the military engages with the population more routinely, it also is exposed further to corruption, military is not trained for issues of public order, is not trained for policing. So we see an increase in human rights abuses. And thereafter, you're putting at risk one of the most trusted institutions in the country because it's being exposed because you're asking it to perform tasks for which it hasn't been trained. And so the alternative to militarization, frankly, I mean, is having an acute military response to a problem is something that I think constitutions across Latin America and the Caribbean do permit for that. What they often do not permit for is a permanent occupation by the military. And so really what it needs to be complemented by is a wholesale reform and professionalization of civilian police forces. And on top of that, professionalization and sufficient resourcing of judiciaries. And this is something that I point to in the book as well. Part of the success of Plan Colombia was that Colombia had undergone a judicial transformation, a judicial reform. It went from an inquisitorial-style justice system to an accusatory-style justice system more akin to the US model prior to the beginning of Plan Colombia. And so as the Colombian state became more effective at capturing and arresting criminals, it had a judicial system that was already trained in a new ideology, or excuse me, a new philosophy and a new methodology of enacting justice, that it was able to process them far more expeditiously than the Mexican justice system, which was undergoing a judicial reform towards an accusatorial justice system simultaneous to the strengthening of its police forces. And so as the police became more capable of capturing people, the justice system was kind of in limbo as its prosecutors were being trained for a new legal reality. And what it resulted in was a 99% impunity rate for all crimes and a 93% impunity rate for homicides. Whereas over similar periods with similar criminal capture flow, we saw the Colombian justice system was significantly more capable of delivering sentences than its Mexican counterpart.
So this leads into my next question, which is with rising insecurity across the region, we could see similar requests for security assistance from the United States. In the case of Ecuador, many have proposed a Plan Colombia for Ecuador. What does your analysis say about how countries in the region might position themselves to better cooperate with the United States on security?
So, I mean, I think there are a couple. I am someone who is a big advocate for partnering with Ecuador on helping President Noboa and his team deal with an unprecedented scourge of crime and violence in the country, for which only institutional professionalization will provide the long-term remedy. However, the situation in Ecuador is very different from the situation that we confronted in Colombia. I think that we also have to recognize that the threat vectors aren't consistent across all of the cases in which we're involving ourselves. Colombia has historically been a drug-producing country. Ecuador is a drug transit country for the most part. And most of the drugs are leaving the port of Guayaquil or the coastal area around Guayaquil for the European market. Secondarily, Colombia was often, because it's a drug-producing country, it was a turf war amongst groups for the land in which coca was grown. You don't see that same dynamic. In Ecuador, it's a turf war for access to ports or access to institutions that you can suborn in your favor. And then finally, in Colombia, you had an insurgent threat that was actually a political military threat. The 22 gangs that have been designated narco-terrorists in Ecuador do not appear to represent any particular ideological or political persuasion. And their ambition is not necessarily to overthrow the state like the FARC or the ELN or the EPL in Colombia, but rather to suborn the state and look for points of entry so that they can get decision makers to make choices that favor their bottom line. And so the dynamics are a little bit different. And in this sense, I would suggest that Ecuador would be ripe for a security assistance partnership that looks a little bit more like the U.S. partnership with Mexico over the years of the Mérida Initiative than the partnership that we struck up during Plan Colombia, in which militarization really was a central component because we were fighting a military threat. Whereas in Mexico, the focus was largely on building up civilian policing capacity. And some of the tools that were most useful in Mexico that will prove to be most useful in Ecuador have to do with financial intelligence, following the money and seeing and disarticulating organizations or networks in which licit actors are hiding money for illicit networks. Secondarily, something that Mexico never quite learned, but I think would prove quite consequential for Ecuador, is a whole-of-government approach to dealing with security challenges. The military alone will not solve all of your problems. The police alone will not solve all of your problems. You really need buy-in and coordination from ministries across government. And that's something that I think that the United States and Colombia, where we saw a real strategic alignment of vision, that the U.S. State Department, U.S. Department of Treasury, U.S. Department of Defense, USAID, were all aligned and were supporting their parallel organizations on the Colombian side through a coordinated country strategy with improving security as the most important objective. We never really saw the Mexican government coalesce around a similar whole-of-government vision for the provision of security. And I think that those are some of the elements or dynamics that would make a Plan Ecuador of sorts successful. And then finally, this is more at the tactical level, but it has strategic implications. In both Colombia and Mexico, there was an inordinate focus on both sides of the bilateral relationship on captures and kills, taking out kingpins, drug kingpins. But as we saw, particularly in Mexico, the more, transnational organized crime groups are like hydras. When you chop off one head, several others spawn from it. And so, the temptation to go after the kingpins never really resulted in resounding strategic successes for the United States or for our partners. And that's just something that we need to be cognizant of, which is, lends itself to the argument that we should really be pursuing those who protect these organizations through our financial intelligence.
The book focuses mostly on our partners and on the actions and capabilities of our partners and how that played into the success of these two initiatives. But you also talk a little bit about our own planning and funding of these security initiatives. Could you talk a little bit about what lessons we can draw from our own government's preparedness for undertaking these sorts of programs?
Yeah, I think the advantage of comparing these two cases is that they both occurred around the same moment in history in which U.S.-Latin American relations were benefited from bipartisan consensus here in Washington, D.C. And I think they had robust bipartisan support, and there was a strategic alignment not just here in Washington, but across the bilateral relationship. That's not something that we're necessarily seeing here in D.C. today. And the only place where we do see it vis-a-vis security assistance is on a consensus that we need to do everything we can to outcompete China. And I think that we run the risk, if we view security assistance as a tool only through the lens of competing with China, then we also sacrifice our ability to understand what other strategic interests are at play in these relationships. And so that's one thing that I think both of these instances of security assistance benefited from the fact that they did not take place against the backdrop of strategic competition or against the backdrop of the Cold War. But something else that I think needs to be a part of the conversation, because security assistance isn't just driven by the Department of Defense. In fact, security assistance, by definition and by law, is driven by the Department of State. But the Department of Defense has a more robust workforce for dealing with, channeling, processing, and implementing security assistance than the State Department. And until we see some congruence between the Department of Defense and the Department of State, the Department of Defense will always have an outsized voice and will in the formulation and implementation of security assistance. And so I think it also begs the question: in terms of resources, how much is the Department of State getting in order to build out its own political military workforce in order to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to channel our investments correctly in ways that are diplomatically coherent, but also able to do the important work of evaluating the impact of those investments. Right now, at least during the implementation of Plan Colombia and the Mérida Initiative, so much of the security assistance that was administered by the Department of Defense was also administered in sort of an ad hoc fashion. I think the Department of Defense has accepted and quite frankly embraced security assistance as a major part of its work. But for the longest time, it was something sort of seen as tangential to the war making, because, mind you, both of these occurred at a time when the United States was actively involved in war in Afghanistan and Iraq. They saw security assistance in Latin America as something tangential to what their primary focus was, and the armed services treated it as such. I think the Department of Defense is moving away from that and looking to professionalize the people who administer security assistance and to accept it as a major plank of the department's tools of engagement globally. But I still think there's more work to be done, and particularly the work to be done on building out the link between DoD and state.
Okay. We have time for a few questions from the audience, so I'd like to open it up for any of our audience. So let me start with Dolia.
Thank you. And I have to confess, I haven't read your book. So I might be asking questions that you already have the answers for in the book. But in your presentation, you haven't mentioned something that in Mexico we believe is perhaps, if not the most difficult problem to fight, to be able to go after the organized crime and so forth. Within the institutions, especially the federal government, is corruption. Corruption played a big role, in my view, and many other people's view and studies, in what you consider the Mérida Initiative not achieving their goals. In other words, pretty much failing. And corruption, like, for instance, Garcia Luna. Garcia Luna was heavily, if not, was a key role, play a key role in the Mérida Initiative and the whole fight against drugs during the Calderon administration. He's waiting to be sentenced because he was colluded with the Sinaloa cartel. So you have a big problem right there. The second problem that I don't know if you address is the DA role, which is massive. I mean, you cannot separate the Mérida Initiative from the DA role, from the DA involvement in Mexico. And the DA is not trusted by pretty much, it's a tradition. It has a very problematic history since the 80s. So that was already a problem to be able to push forward the Mérida Initiative. I wonder if you have any comments to what extent do you see that these two elements, corruption and the DA, lack of trust on the institution of the DA up until today. López Obrador pretty much, stop collaborating with them. What was the input that these
Sure.
two things had in the failure of the Mérida Initiative in Mexico?
Well, so I agree entirely that corruption was one of the big spoilers of the Mérida Initiative and its strategic ambition. And I mostly address the issue of corruption in the chapter in which I talk about federalism, because corruption was happening at 3 levels of government. And so you had institutions that were supposedly on the same team fighting for the security of the Mexican people who were working at odds with each other because they had been corrupted by different drug actors. And I think quite famously in Ciudad Juarez, you had the federal police, or elements of the federal police, were operating with one cartel, whereas the local police in Ciudad Juarez were acting on behalf of another cartel. And there were instances in which you had members of police forces in Mexico who were going to blows with each other on the street. So corruption was a particular spoiler in the case of the Mérida Initiative. And you mentioned Garcia Luna. I think Garcia Luna is representative of a thinking amongst some Mexican political elites that who have embraced a principle of the pre-years that violence is something that can be managed. And there's a belief that you can you can coax or entice violent actors into less violent behavior through protection mechanisms. And I think that there have been any number of instances over the last 2 decades in which you've seen Mexican politicians or the people who work for them in their cabinets who have sought to protect violent actors because they believe that that's the path to violence reduction. But what it really ends up doing is extending legitimacy to people and organizations that don't have the best interests of the Mexican people at heart.
Well, Garcia Luna was also being protected by the U.S. government.
I mean, this goes to show the limits of U.S. power, frankly. We can't pick and choose who we engage with in parallel cabinets. I mean, Mexico is a sovereign nation. They elect their leaders, and, it frankly is, there's often an assumption that the United States is puppeteering everything in every corner of the world. At the end of the day, it's particularly in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been a strong consensus that we will work with whatever government is in power. I'm not privy to what information the United States had about Garcia Luna and his associations, but at the end of the day, he was the director of the national security and the head of the federal police, and that was a decision that was made by President Calderon. On the issue of the DEA, I do discuss the DEA as an organization within the U.S. government that has a different set of objectives than that in some ways, in some cases, complement our diplomatic objectives with partners, but in other cases do not. There's a difference in the way that the DEA both acted and represented the work that it was doing in Colombia and Mexico. In Colombia, the DEA, in terms of the support that the DEA was offering and delivering to the Colombian government, was significantly smaller in terms of financial resources than the kind of support that was being given by the Department of Defense. And so the Department of Defense had an outsized voice in the way that the message was being portrayed. And so whereas instances of corruption that were brought to the justice system in Colombia were represented as incremental progress in a binational effort to reduce drug violence and corruption, we didn't see that same kind of presentation of corruption, at least as the DEA engaged with it in Mexico. The DEA has a long history of using its platform to name and shame and represent corruption in the Mexican government as evidence of a systemic flaw. This dates back to the killing of Kiki Camarena. And so the outsized voice that the DEA has in Mexico, I think, reflects an autonomy that the DEA may not enjoy in other countries around the world. And there have been a number of instances or public reflections by former ambassadors who recognize that the DEA and DEA agents are law enforcement professionals at the end of the day, and they're always working in the pursuit of justice. But when you're managing a bilateral relationship with another country, and particularly a country where the United States shares a 2,000-mile border with that nation, there are a plethora of other strategic interests that are at play that may or may not align with the pursuit of justice at all costs. And that, I think, was something that presented an inherent contradiction in U.S. messaging in the U.S.-Mexico relationship over the years of the Mérida Initiative.
Here.
I find a number of anomalies in your explanation of these two programs. The anomalies seem to me to be, one, what is the American objective in these programs versus what is the local objective in these programs? And is domestic tranquility in Mexico one of our objectives? And I think it should be, because it spreads its infection back to the United States. The second question I have is, how different are the cultures of the South American countries that are not very receptive, I'm going to use that word, receptive, to the improvements that the American government would like to see, both inside those countries and in the relationship? And I guess I'd conclude with, you noticed that the business community in Mexico has not been very supportive of the improvements that we hope to see. But I think that the business community in Mexico has improved despite the policies of the AMLO government, to the point where AMLO's a hero in terms of how prosperous the country has become. And maybe that will change the democratic election process, but it doesn't seem that it will. So I'm sorry for such a long dialogue. But
no, yeah, I mean, I think your initial point gets to a central theme in the book, is that the lack of real alignment, strategic alignment between U.S. objectives and partner objectives led to an underwhelming set of outcomes in Mexico. Whereas Colombia and the United States both understood Plan Colombia as an effort to go after drug gangs. It was a stabilization mission, a counter-narcotics mission, a counter-terrorism mission, and a state-building mission, and a democratic deepening mission, and it was understood as such by partners on both sides of that bilateral relationship. The Mérida Initiative for Mexico, and this persisted through the Peña Nieto years, was oftentimes merely seen as an opportunity to access equipment and technology and expertise that the Mexican military and police had otherwise not had access to for decades preceding it. And for the United States, I think the strategic ambition was one of stabilization and counter-narcotics, and professionalization of the military as a component of democracy promotion. And those expectations were not matched on the Mexican side of the equation, at least at the sort of the highest level of government over the span of the Mérida Initiative's implementation. The one thing that I will say surprises me about the Mexican economy in recent years is that violence and insecurity have not disturbed the investment climate in the country, which means that there's probably some level of business community accommodation of organized crime across the national territory, particularly as we see the national territory become all the more fractured. There are more drug gangs competing for turf and space and influence in Mexico today than there were at the beginning of the Mérida Initiative. That means that there are all kinds of opportunities for them to exert their influence through a philosophy of plato plomo. You take the bullet or you take the bribe across the national territory. And it's surprising to me that insecurity hasn't been more of a deterrent for investors.
Any other questions?
So what's the reason you give for that?
I don't know. I mean, this is the thing that I find so perplexing about my experiences doing work in Mexico and Colombia were so different because in Mexico, I think partly because it's a federal system, partly because it's a large country, partly because of the bilateral relationship and the cross-border dynamics. It's a more complex relationship. It's harder to understand, and it's harder to know what you don't know. Versus in Colombia, there was a fairly clear narrative that when I spoke to representatives of the Colombian government, when I spoke to representatives of civil society, when I spoke to representatives of the business community, they were all, for the most part, painting the same picture for me. The same could not be said of my experience doing field work in Mexico. And so there, I think that there are just so many more factors at play, and it's really hard to pin down why the business community is behaving in a particular way in a particular subregion of the country. But it does beguile me that insecurity has frankly not proven a major deterrent for investment. Likewise, insecurity is also not proving to be a major electoral issue in Mexico today. And that should be surprising for everyone. Homicides are higher than they have been at any point in history. And Mexican voters aren't concerned about President López Obrador's record, frankly, on insecurity. It's been the most deadly sexenio in the history of Mexico since the Mexican Revolution. But nobody's asking Morena why insecurity has spiraled out of control. Yet they held Calderón and the PAN to account for it in 2012. So it's a really unique feature of the Mexican political and social system today that I haven't quite figured out.
Paul, one last question. You mentioned the topic of leverage sort of in passing in a discussion about the human rights component of security assistance. And clearly in Plan Colombia, there was the resources provided by the United States were much more significant relative to the overall funding compared to Mexico. Would you say that the leverage provided by that funding could be another factor in the success of Plan Colombia relative to Mérida?
Yeah, I mean, so human rights was a part of every conversation that was being had during the negotiating phase and the implementation of Plan Colombia. And Colombia was one of the places where I think the United States more stringently applied the Leahy law. I mean, the United States applies the Leahy law everywhere. The security assistance is being offered to partner forces. But it was a very serious component of Plan Colombia. And the human rights conditionality was taken very seriously by our partners on the Colombian side of the equation. When the United States said from the get-go of Plan Colombia, any contact that Colombian security forces have with paramilitary groups will not be tolerated. And those groups will no longer be eligible for US support. They will not pass vetting. They will not come to our training schools. They will not be the recipients of our Black Hawks. That was taken very seriously by the Colombians. And because of a centralized system and decision-making process, when the minister said, this is not something we will tolerate, it trickled down. And people were held to account within the organization when transgressions occurred. In Mexico, human rights conditionality was a politically sensitive topic from the get-go. And instead of doing a formal conditionality program as we had had been elemental to our Plan Colombia design, the United States government and Mexico set up a sort of a routine roundtable where civil society organizations and representatives of government and the security forces would get together, and the complaints would be filed and heard by the government, and those would go into reports, routine reporting to via this Department of State to the U.S. Congress. I think those spaces were important spaces for dialogue, but the Mexican government has a real problem with transparency when it comes to the way that it presents reported abuses committed by Mexican security forces. There's great secrecy with which cases of human rights abuses have been treated historically, and serious and systematic underreporting of those abuses. Moreover, we saw reported denunciations or allegations of abuse by Sedena and Semar increase over the years of the Mérida Initiative, but many times in annual cycles they would not break out that data for what the level of the abuse was. And so you'd see in a given year 1,300 abuses that were attributable to security forces or the military forces in Mexico, but 1,100 of them would be arbitrary detention, something that is a human rights abuse, but it's not on the scale of extrajudicial murder. But because of the lack of transparency in the reporting process, and we really only have anecdotal evidence of where we know security forces have been involved in high-profile human rights abuses. Whereas in Colombia, we had very granular knowledge about how different units within the Colombian military and police were behaving and what kinds of relationships they had with organized crime groups, or what kinds of abuses had been attributable to them, and whether or not those abuses were being advanced in the justice system. And therein lies, I think, one of the major lessons, is that Colombia had a functioning justice system, and although justice was delayed in the case of the false positives that were being committed by members of the Colombian security forces, justice was delivered in the long run, and we haven't seen a similar effort on part of the Mexican government in delivering justice for abuses that are potentially attributable to state security forces.
Okay, thank you. Paul, your book is an important and timely contribution to our understanding, not just of Plan Colombia and the Mérida Initiative, but our understanding of security assistance writ large. Thank you for coming to Hudson today. I hope the book is widely read. To our audience, thank you for coming. Have a good day.
Thank you.